there is several ways of mixing signals together. The most common way is of course how you do it on a mixing desk, where basically every signal has its own knob. But there is also one quite interesting subject which is called redundancy. That is, can you actually mix with less knobs than a knob for every channel or for every signal you have? And yeah, that's possible because you can mix two signals with only one knob. And you can do that with a crossfader. And the advantage of a crossfader is that you will never have silence. So you see on many older vintage analog keyboard synthesizers like the Minimoog, that for instance you have like 3 oscillators, and then you have an oscillator mixer where you have 3 knobs, one for each oscillator. But that occasionally gives you the situation on stage where all these 3 mixer knobs are closed and you want to play and there is no sound and you wonder, oh, what's going on? Actually, if you use a crossfader, that can never happen because a crossfader will always pass on one signal. And you can actually sort of expand on these crossfaders because you can mix 2 signals with one knob. Then that mix can be mixed with a 3rd signal with another knob. So basically you could mix 5 signals with 4 knobs and always have the situation that that will at least always be sound. So it's a quite interesting kind of thing. The interesting thing about crossfaders is that if you make them voltage controlled, you also only need one control voltage to control the mix of the 2 signals, which also gives you a certain advantage. Because if you use 2 separate voltage controlled amplifiers that need 2 probably opposite control voltages, you also need a module that would change your one control voltage into its opposite, and then actually it becomes a bit more complex patching. So there is one section here in this panel, nicely situated exactly in the middle, that contains 2 voltage controlled faders. And I say faders because you can either, each one you can either use as a crossfader, where you mix 2 signals into one. You can use it as a panner, where you have one signal that you distribute over 2 outputs. And you can use it as a so-called docker, which means that you use 2 inputs and 2 outputs, and if one input and output open, the other closes. And docking is not used much in music, but for instance it's used a lot in film, where you would have music and then suddenly there's the narrative, and then when the narrative starts, the music automatically attenuates slightly, and when the narrative stops it comes up back again, preferably in a way that it sounds natural. But in electronic music, ducking is also quite interesting because very often you work in layers. And if you sort of want to fade out one layer, that it maybe goes to a speaker over there, you would like to fade in another layer on a speaker over there, and then basically this ducking situation would do that job for you. There is no switches on the module that tell you whether you are crossfading or panning or whatever, because basically it's all done with the normalization of the connectors. That means that if you take an oscillator signal, you put it in input 1 or input A, and you take another oscillator signal and you put that in input B, and we open both oscillators and we listen to the so-called AX or L output. can very easily set the mix and crossfade between the two. And this is under voltage control. So I can take an LFO signal and thus create different effects. Only if I want total silence I will have to close both the oscillators, but as there are level controls on the oscillators, that's quite easy to do with this system. If you want to do panning, then basically you only need one input signal, and in that case you always take the one input signal, the A1 or the B1. But then you need two outputs. So then I go to the stereo output here, and you hear that I'm now panning, and I can again modulate this. Do it quite fast. And now an interesting subject, because I already said early this morning that if you make changes to the level, dynamic changes to the level of a signal, you also will hear certain effects happening on the pitch of that signal. And so if I do a very slow panning, and because a sine wave is very difficult to play spatially, I now explicitly using a sine signal. Now when I start to speed up this amplitude modulation, you hear that I'm also changing the pitch. And that is because we actually multiply two waveforms with each other. And if you multiply two waveforms that span over time, you will get in the result so-called upper and lower sideband frequencies that are away from the original pitches. If I do this with another sine wave instead of with a triangle wave, for instance with the other oscillator, that you get an effect that is very similar to ring modulation or FM modulation or that kind of thing. And that is because you're creating new harmonics that are not, actually you're creating new partials that are not necessarily harmonic to the original pitches. And all these techniques have share the same property. So this is the panning, and if we want to do the ducking, then basically we go back to this, and you hear that if one channel comes up, the other goes down. Okay. The interesting thing is that you can actually sort of use one signal and with the FADER function distribute it into different kind of effects. Like you can sort of use this, if I take this one oscillator, or actually maybe take the sawtooth, the plain sawtooth, because that is always a very good signal. I can sort of use a 24 dB filter here and connect this output to the 24 dB filter and the other. And that way distribute my one signal to different sorts of processing, and especially if you just let the signal at one side go to like a filter, but at the other like a completely different kind of thing, like a pitch shifter or anything else that will make it into a completely different signal, then you can just very easily share, for instance, just one oscillator to create completely different sounds and quite quickly go to another kind of sound. The same of course goes to for the crossfader, because you can have two completely different voices that go into the crossfader and mix into that one output. But many times this sort of voltage control distribution function of the panner is interesting. And sometimes it's also interesting to do the same kind of thing with another oscillator, because for that I can just use and for the modulation function that now comes from a separate LFO, I could for instance also take the output of this oscillator it is the difference in tuning between the two oscillators that also produces a slight vibrato kind of effect that you can And then I can use one of the outputs to modulate the filter. Modulate the other filter with the other output. And create super complex sounds and modulations, which are basically all under voltage control. And because I have one volume level knob here on this oscillator that is part in this complex patching, I can eventually take like an envelope generator and even sort of do more modulations, and that way build it up. And come back to my one oscillator, and that's it, folks, for today. It's kind of situation. No, it's not over yet. Yeah. So you just have to experiment with this dual fader module, because you've seen I only used one of the two faders now, with two oscillators, two filters, and maybe one or two other modulation sources, and you can already make a very, very complex drone, and then maybe 2 or 3 knobs slowly over time create sort of like a soundscape that changes slowly over time under manual control, but has enough stuff going on that could be interesting to use as a drone.
What are those the settings on the dual fader, the 3 settings on the side?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So basically the dual fader has only 2 main knobs that you need to do the fader, the crossfader, the panner, and the ducking effect. And but each one has 2 more knobs, and these do some extra functionality. One of the extra functions is that you can actually increase the input sensitivity of the secondary input of the fader by some almost 20 dBs. The reason why you would want to do that is because if you would like to use another instrument that has a so-called line level output, for instance an MP3 player, a laptop, or some other instrument, then the signal level of that instrument will be very low in comparison to the signal levels that go on in this system. Maybe you would have the question, why are the signal levels in a modular system always so high in relation to all the other equipment that I have? Well, that basically has to do with normalization, not the normalization that's in your connectors, but that other kind of normalization, where basically it means that one volt change in a CV signal would sort of make a 1 octave change in a pitch or in a filter cutoff or something like that. And because the audio range is something like 10 octaves, that means that to sweep an oscillator through the whole audible range, you will need 10 volts, so a 10 volt signal. But it's also nice to have oscillators that can go even lower, that can actually go from audio range into the slow LFO range. So it is really nice if you have oscillators with a span of like 14, 16, 18 dBs. And the same actually also goes for filters, because then you don't have to make a distinction between audio oscillators and modulation rate oscillators. But that also means that if you want to sweep over that range, you need voltage swings of 14, 16, 18 volts. And a line level signal is sort of like a voltage swing of 1 volt. So that wouldn't do much. So the reason why these signal levels are so high is because you really want to be able to modulate very deeply. And then you need these high signals. But that also means never connect the output of an oscillator straight into your laptop, because that will severely overload the input of your laptop and not give you a nice but a very distorted recording. So you need to sort of go through some DI box or mixing desk that can actually handle such a hot signal level.